She walked into the courtroom expecting routine business, but within seconds, she was blindsided with a $10,000 fine. No explanation. No due process. Just a gavel slam and a smug judge who thought he had the final say. But Pam Bondi isn't one to roll over. With the entire courtroom watching, she flips the script, exposing the cracks in the system and putting a power-hungry judge on the ropes. And just when she thinks she's got him cornered, the system fights back, hard. This isn't just a legal battle. It's a high-stakes showdown where one wrong move could cost her everything. Will she outmaneuver the judges and take down the corrupt ruling? Or is she about to become their next target? Stay locked in, because what happens at the end will change everything. Chapter 1. The $10,000 Blindside. Pam Bondi pushed through the heavy wooden doors of courtroom 3B, expecting just another routine hearing. The kind where she'd check a few boxes, present a couple of arguments, and be out before lunch. But the second she stepped inside, she felt it. Something was off. The air was too still. The usual courthouse hum, whispers, shuffling papers, the occasional throat clearing was missing. Instead, silence. Heavy, waiting. She barely had time to take her seat before Judge Dalton's gavel cracked against the bench. "Ms. Bondi," he said, his voice carrying a sharpness she hadn't expected. "You are hereby fined $10,000. Pam froze. A fine? For what? She straightened, forcing her expression into something neutral. "Your Honor, I'm going to need some clarification here. What exactly am I being fined for?" Dalton barely looked up from his paperwork. "Court doesn't entertain interruptions, Ms. Bondi." A murmur rippled through the room. Pam clenched her jaw. "All right, so that's how he wanted to play this." She took a slow breath. "With all due respect, Judge, I haven't interrupted anything. You just hit me with a $10,000 fine without so much as an explanation. I think I'm entitled to ask." Dalton's gaze lifted, cold and sharp. "You think you're entitled?" The way he said it sent a chill through the room. Pam kept her voice even. "Yes. Due process isn't a suggestion, Your Honor." A low, collective inhale from the gallery. A challenge. Dalton's lips pressed into a thin line. "This is my courtroom, Ms. Bondi. You don't dictate how I run it." Pam felt the weight of every eye on her. She knew this was a trap, knew she was supposed to back down, but that wasn't her style. She leaned forward, hands braced against the table. "So let me get this straight. You're fining me 10 grand, right here, right now, without explanation, without a hearing, and without citing a single legal basis." Dalton tilted his head slightly, as if amused. "That's correct." Pam exhaled, shaking her head. "And here I thought we still followed the Constitution in this courtroom." Silence. Heavy. Dangerous. The court stenographer stopped typing. Dalton's eyes darkened. "Tread carefully, Ms. Bondi." Pam knew she was pushing it. Knew he could hit her with contempt if he really wanted to. But that wasn't the point. The point was that he was making an example out of her. And the more people who saw it, the better. She turned slightly, scanning the room. Jurors, clerks, spectators. They were all watching, wide-eyed, waiting to see what she'd do next. She squared her shoulders. "I challenge this fine." Dalton smirked, resting his chin on his hand. "On what grounds?" "On the grounds that it's illegal as hell." A sharp gasp from someone in the back. The gallery shifted, whispers growing. Dalton's smirk vanished. "Watch yourself." Pam crossed her arms. "Or what? You'll slap me with another fine? Make it an even 20? Dalton's knuckles went white against the bench. Bingo. He hadn't expected her to fight back this hard, this fast. He thought she'd take the hit, swallow the punishment, and move on like every other lawyer who'd been on the wrong end of his gavel. But Pam Bondi wasn't every other lawyer. And this fight was just getting started. Chapter 2. The gloves come off. Pam could feel the heat rising in her chest, but she forced herself to stay cool. This wasn't just a fine anymore. This was a message. A warning. Sit down. Shut up. Play along. Screw that. She straightened, voice steady. "Your Honor, I'm formally challenging this fine on the basis of due process violations." Dalton leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, that smug little smirk playing on his lips again. "And who exactly do you think you're talking to, Ms. Bondi?" Pam didn't blink. "A judge who seems awfully comfortable ignoring constitutional law." A sharp gasp from the gallery. Even the bailiff looked up. Dalton's jaw twitched. Good. She was getting under his skin. His voice came out slow, measured. "You're dangerously close to contempt, counselor." Pam tilted her head, matching his tone. "And you're dangerously close to judicial misconduct, Your Honor." The courtroom had officially turned into a pressure cooker. The clerk stopped typing. The spectators sat motionless. Everyone knew something big was happening, but no one dared breathe too loud. Dalton's knuckles tapped against his bench. A slow, controlled rhythm. Tap, tap, tap. Then, finally, you want to challenge my ruling? Fine. State your argument. Pam could almost hear the unspoken challenge beneath his words. Go ahead. Try me. So she did. She took a breath, then turned slightly, addressing the room, making sure every single person was listening. The Supreme Court has ruled time and time again that financial penalties imposed without due process violate the 5th and 14th Amendments. Dalton chuckled, shaking his head. And where exactly are you going with this? Pam's eyes locked onto his. I'm saying your ruling is illegal, and I have case law to prove it. A flicker of something crossed his face. Annoyance? Uncertainty? She pushed forward. In Matthews versus Eldridge, the court ruled that due process requires an opportunity to be heard before penalties can be enforced. You just hit me with 10 grand out of nowhere. No hearing, no justification. That's a textbook violation. Dalton's smirk tightened. Ms. Bondi, this is my courtroom. I decide how things run here. Pam let the silence stretch. Then she let out a quiet, humorless laugh. See, that's where you're wrong. The law decides. And you? You're just supposed to follow it. Boom. Dalton's nostrils flared, and for the first time, he actually looked rattled. He opened his mouth, then stopped. Thinking. Calculating. Pam saw it right then. He wasn't expecting a fight. He thought he could steamroll her, make her an example, and move on like nothing happened. But now? Now, he had a problem. Dalton shifted in his seat, adjusting his robe like it suddenly felt too tight. Then, with a clipped tone, he waved a hand. Fine. You've made your case. Continue. Translation. You just made this a hell of a lot harder for me. Pam didn't smile. Not yet. This wasn't a win. This was just round one. And if Dalton thought she was backing down now, he was in for a long day. Chapter 3. Cracking the judge's armor. Pam could feel the shift in the room. Dalton wasn't smirking anymore. He wasn't leaning back like this was some casual power trip. No, he was sitting up, jaw tight, fingers drumming against his bench. She had him. Now, she just had to press harder. Since Your Honor is so interested in legal precedent, she said, keeping her voice cool, let's talk about State versus Howell. That case overturned a fine just like this one, because the statute used to justify it was too vague to be legally enforceable. Dalton's lips thinned. This court is not bound by Howell. Pam nodded. You're right. It's not. But the Supreme Court is another story. The gallery was completely still. Even the bailiff, who usually looked half asleep, was awake now, watching. Dalton exhaled slowly through his nose. He glanced at the court reporter, as if to remind everyone that this was all being recorded. His voice was steady, but there was a crack in it now, barely noticeable. Ms. Bondi, if you believe my ruling is in error, you are welcome to appeal it. Pam smiled. That's exactly what I plan to do. But before we get there, let's clear something up. Dalton arched a brow. Enlighten me. Pam stepped closer to the table, resting her palms flat. The statute you're using to justify this fine, how many times has it actually been enforced in the last 5 years? Silence. Dalton's throat bobbed. He knew where she was going. She continued. I checked before I walked in here today. Want to guess the answer? Dalton stayed quiet. Twice, Pam said, letting the word land like a hammer. 2 times. In 5 years. And both cases? Overturned on appeal. A low murmur rippled through the gallery. Pam didn't turn to look, but she could feel it, momentum shifting. People paying attention in a way they hadn't before. Dalton tapped his gavel once. The details of prior cases have no bearing on the matter before this court. Pam tilted her head. Oh, but they do. Because if this fine was legitimate, it would have been enforced more than twice in 5 years. But it hasn't, because every time someone challenges it, it collapses under scrutiny. And now, it's happening again. Dalton's fingers curled around the edge of his bench. He wanted to shut her down. He wanted to end this. But he couldn't. Not without proving her point. He inhaled sharply, then, without looking at her, flicked his hand toward the clock. Recess. 15 minutes. And just like that, he stood, turned, and disappeared through the judge's chambers. Pam didn't move. Didn't even blink. 15 minutes? No. This wasn't a recess. This was retreat. Dalton needed time to think, to regroup, maybe even to figure out just how badly he'd underestimated her. Pam sat down, crossed one leg over the other, and exhaled slowly. He could take 15 minutes. Take an hour. Hell, take the whole day. It wouldn't change a damn thing. She wasn't done. Not even close. Chapter 4. The Judge Strikes Back. 15 minutes came and went. When Dalton finally strode back into the courtroom, something was different. He wasn't rattled anymore. He looked collected, controlled, like a man who had just decided exactly how he was going to win. Pam didn't like that. She sat up straighter as he settled into his chair, adjusting his robe with slow precision. "Court is back in session," he said, voice smooth, unreadable. "Ms. Bondi, you may continue. Within reason." Within reason. Pam didn't miss the warning buried in those two words. Dalton was done playing defense. Now, he was setting the rules. She folded her hands on the table. "Your Honor, I've presented clear evidence that this fine is not only unjustified but legally indefensible. And yet, instead of addressing those facts, you called a recess." Dalton gave her a measured look. "I called a recess because you were grandstanding." Pam smiled. "Is that what we're calling due process now?" A ripple of amusement flickered through the gallery, but Dalton shut it down fast. His gavel slammed once. Enough. His voice had a bite to it now. Pam stayed quiet, watching, waiting. Dalton leaned forward slightly. "You think you're exposing some grand conspiracy here, Ms. Bondi? You're not. The law is the law, and as far as this courtroom is concerned, I am the law." There it was, the mask slipping. Pam exhaled slowly. "That's the problem, isn't it?" Dalton's eyes narrowed. She continued, voice steady. "You don't get to be the law, Your Honor. The law exists whether you like it or not. And right now, it's not on your side." Dalton sat back, fingers steepled. "And yet, here you are, still in my courtroom, still at my mercy." The weight of his words settled over the room like a storm cloud. Pam's pulse ticked up, but she refused to look away. Dalton wasn't trying to argue anymore. He was trying to remind her of his power, of his authority, of the fact that, right now, he held the gavel, and she didn't. But what he didn't realize, Pam had never needed a gavel to win. She let the silence stretch, then leaned forward. "I'm curious, Judge. If you're so confident in this ruling, why bring in a senior judge?" The courtroom shifted. Dalton's expression didn't change, but his fingers twitched against the bench. Pam had hit a nerve. "I didn't bring in anyone," he said smoothly. "Judge Whitaker is simply observing the proceedings." Pam tilted her head. "Right. Just a casual observer. Nothing to do with the fact that this fine is crumbling under scrutiny." Dalton's voice dropped. "Careful, Miss Bondi." Pam's jaw tightened. She could feel the shift now. Dalton wasn't just playing defense anymore. He was setting her up, laying a trap, waiting for her to push too hard, say too much, give him an excuse to shut her down for good. She inhaled through her nose, forcing herself to ease back. Not retreating, just recalibrating. She wasn't going to play into his hands. Not now. Not when she was this close. Instead, she met his gaze head on. "I'm ready to proceed." Dalton studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Then let's continue." But something in his tone sent a chill up her spine. Because this wasn't over. Not even close. Chapter 5. The System Fights Back. Pam barely had time to settle before the side door creaked open. Every head in the courtroom turned as an older man in a black robe stepped inside, walking with the kind of slow, deliberate pace that screamed authority. Judge Whitaker. Pam's stomach tightened. Dalton had called in the cavalry. Whitaker took a seat beside Dalton, folding his hands neatly on the bench. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his gaze, a quiet, assessing sharpness that made it clear he wasn't just here to watch. Dalton cleared his throat. "As a matter of judicial procedure, Judge Whitaker will be sitting in for the remainder of this hearing." Pam let that sit for a second. He wanted her to react, to be thrown off, to look rattled in front of the courtroom. She didn't give him the satisfaction. Instead, she leaned back, crossing her arms. "Well, 2 judges for 1 fine. Guess I really struck a nerve." A few quiet chuckles rippled through the gallery before Dalton silenced them with a glare. Whitaker spoke for the first time, his voice even controlled. "Ms. Bondi, this isn't about striking nerves. It's about maintaining order in this courtroom." Pam met his gaze. "Then I assume you'll be ensuring due process is followed?" Whitaker didn't blink. "That remains to be seen." A classic non-answer. Dalton straightened. "Ms. Bondi, let's get to the heart of the matter. You claim this fine is unlawful, yet the statute allows for judicial discretion. Are you suggesting judges don't have the authority to impose penalties as they see fit?" Pam exhaled slowly. He was twisting her argument, trying to make her look like she was challenging the very foundation of judicial power. Clever. Too bad she was ready. "What I'm suggesting," she said, voice crisp, "is that discretion doesn't mean unchecked power. A judge can't just decide they don't like someone and hit them with a fine out of nowhere. That's not discretion. That's abuse. Dalton's face darkened. Whitaker lifted a brow. Strong words, counselor. Pam shrugged. Strong abuse. Silence stretched, thick as smoke. Then Whitaker leaned forward slightly, studying her like she was a puzzle he was trying to solve. You've made quite the argument, Ms. Bondi. But tell me, if you're so confident in your case, why are you arguing here instead of simply filing an appeal? Pam let out a short laugh. Because you both know that's the game, don't you? Judges make bad rulings, force lawyers to waste months, sometimes years, fighting them, and by the time it's overturned, the damage is already done. Dalton's gavel slammed. That's enough. Pam held his stare. Hit a nerve. Dalton inhaled sharply, but before he could speak, Whitaker raised a hand. That's enough for now, the senior judge said, voice calm but firm. We'll take another recess. Pam watched as Dalton stood too quickly, his robe billowing as he stormed off. Whitaker, however, didn't move. He simply sat there, watching her, like he was waiting for something. After a long beat, he spoke again, softer this time. Careful, Miss Bondi. You might not like what happens next. Pam didn't flinch. Neither will you, she said, and walked out. Chapter 6. The Evidence Trap. Pam knew the moment she walked back into the courtroom that something had shifted. The energy felt different, colder, heavier. Dalton was back in his seat, jaw tight, fingers tapping impatiently. Whitaker sat beside him, still unreadable, but now there was something else in his eyes. Calculation. Pam had spent years in courtrooms. She knew a setup when she saw one. Dalton cleared his throat. Before we proceed, the court will hear testimony from Officer Reynolds, the enforcement officer who issued the initial fine. Pam tensed. So this was the play. Dalton was done arguing the law, because he was losing that battle. Now, he was trying to make this about facts, about evidence. If they could create the illusion that the fine was justified, then it didn't matter how strong her legal argument was. She glanced at the gallery. The audience was hooked now, leaning in, waiting to see what came next. Fine. If Dalton wanted a battle, she'd give him one. The bailiff called in Reynolds, a uniformed officer in his late 50s with tired eyes and a stiff posture. He took the stand, swore in, and sat down, his hands gripping the armrest like he was bracing for impact. Dalton folded his hands. Officer Reynolds, please explain why this fine was issued. Reynolds cleared his throat. There was a violation, oh. Pam cut in. What violation? Dalton shot her a glare. You'll have your chance for cross-examination, Miss Bondi. Pam sat back, letting Reynolds continue. There was a failure to comply with procedural regulations, the officer said, voice steady. Pam narrowed her eyes. Vague. Purposefully vague. She waited until he finished, then stood. Your Honor, I'd like to cross-examine the witness. Dalton hesitated, just a fraction of a second, before nodding. Proceed. Pam walked to the stand, keeping her tone casual. Officer Reynolds, you mentioned a failure to comply. Can you specify exactly what wasn't complied with? Reynolds shifted. The standard procedural requirement. Pam nodded like she was considering that. Right. And which specific procedure was violated? Reynolds' fingers twitched. Pam waited. Finally, he muttered, I'd have to check the documentation. Pam let that hang in the air for a moment. Then she turned, addressing the room. So just to clarify, this fine was issued, enforced, and upheld without even confirming the exact violation? Dalton stiffened. That's not what the officer said. Pam held up a hand. Then let's be precise. She turned back to Reynolds. Officer, did you personally verify that a violation occurred before issuing this fine? Reynolds swallowed. I followed standard procedure. Pam tilted her head. That's not what I asked. Silence. The gallery was locked in now. The tension was thick enough to cut. Reynolds licked his lips. I was acting on an administrative directive. Pam's heart kicked up. There it was. She stepped in closer. So you were ordered to issue the fine without verifying a violation? Reynolds hesitated. Pam leaned in slightly. Yes or no, officer? Reynolds exhaled through his nose. Yes. Boom. The gallery erupted in whispers. Dalton slammed his gavel. Enough. Pam didn't move. Didn't blink. She turned back to Dalton, voice calm, steady. Your Honor, we now have sworn testimony that this fine was issued without proper verification. That alone makes it invalid. Dalton's face was stone, but Pam could see it, the crack forming, the shift in his eyes. She had him. And now? Now he had to decide whether he was going to double down or back down. Either way, she wasn't done. Not yet. Chapter 7. when the system breaks. For the first time since this circus started, Dalton looked unsure. Not angry. Not smug. Just stuck. Pam had him boxed in. Reynolds' testimony wasn't something he could just brush off. It was on the record now, a ticking time bomb sitting in the middle of the courtroom. And the gallery knew it. People were whispering, shifting in their seats. The court reporter's fingers hovered over the keys, waiting. Even Whitaker was watching Dalton now, his expression unreadable but his silence saying plenty. Pam didn't move, didn't say a word. She wanted Dalton to speak first, because whatever he said next, it was going to define everything. Dalton exhaled through his nose, slow and controlled. Then he tapped his gavel once, just once. "The court," he said, voice measured, "will take a brief recess." Pam's pulse kicked up. Recess? She narrowed her eyes, scanning his face, his posture. This wasn't retreat. This was stalling. Dalton needed time. Time to figure out a way out of this mess without admitting defeat. Pam stood, smoothing out her blazer. "Your Honor, before you clear this courtroom, I'd like the record to reflect that the state has failed to provide a legal basis for this fine." Dalton's gavel slammed down. "I said recess." A flicker of something dark flashed in his eyes. Pam clenched her jaw. He was rattled. Yeah, but he wasn't broken. Not yet. Dalton stood abruptly and disappeared through the side door. Whitaker, however, didn't follow. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, watching Pam the way a chess player watches their opponent before making a move. Slow. Calculating. Pam turned to pack up her files when a quiet voice stopped her. "Miss Bondi." She glanced up. Whitaker was still seated, his fingers interlaced, his expression unreadable. But his tone? It had weight. "You should know," he said. "You've made this very difficult for yourself." Pam let out a short, humorless laugh. "Oh, I'm so sorry for insisting on actual due process." Whitaker didn't react. He just kept looking at her, studying her. Then, after a beat, he spoke again. "You're not fighting a case anymore," he said. "You're fighting the system." Pam's fingers curled around the edge of the table. "I know," she said. Whitaker held her gaze for another second, then nodded once, like he had just confirmed something for himself. Then he stood and left the courtroom. Pam exhaled. The gallery was still buzzing, people whispering, speculating, waiting for the next round. She grabbed her files and turned toward the exit. Because this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Chapter 8. The System Blinks First. Pam walked back into the courtroom, her heels clicking against the marble floor. The air felt thick, charged, like everyone knew they were seconds away from something big but didn't know which way it would break. Dalton was already seated, stone-faced, his hands folded tightly on the bench. Whitaker was beside him, still unreadable, still watching. Pam didn't sit. She stood at the defense table, waiting. Dalton exhaled through his nose. After reviewing the arguments presented, the court has decided to. He stopped, jaw clenched. Pam saw it before he even said the words. He didn't want to do this. He had to. Dalton's fingers tapped once against the bench before he forced the words out. "Reverse the fine." A beat of silence. Then, the gallery erupted. Gasps. Whispers. A ripple of disbelief. Even the court reporter looked up, eyes wide. Pam let the moment settle before she spoke. "So, just to be clear, Your Honor, this fine was issued without due process, without proper verification, and is now being overturned?" Dalton's glare could have cut through steel. "That is the ruling." Pam nodded. "Good to have that on the record." Dalton's knuckles went white against the bench. He wanted her gone. Wanted this over. But Pam wasn't done. She turned, her voice carrying through the courtroom. "And for every other case where this fine was issued under the same circumstances?" Dalton's expression barely changed, but his silence spoke volumes. He knew what she was doing, and he hated it. Pam turned back to him. "How many other people were fined without proof, Your Honor?" Whitaker finally spoke. "That is beyond the scope of this hearing." Pam met his gaze. "Not for the people who paid those fines." A flicker of something crossed Whitaker's face. Approval? Amusement? Hard to tell. But he didn't argue. Dalton, though? He looked like he was ready to throw his gavel through the wall. Pam exhaled, collected her files, and smoothed out her blazer. This fight was over. But the war? Just getting started. She turned to leave, and as she passed the bench, Whitaker spoke again. Quiet. Just for her. "Watch yourself, Miss Bondi." Pam paused, just for a second. Then, without looking back, she walked out of the courtroom. Because she wasn't watching her back. She was making sure they had to watch theirs. The day a judge lost control, Pam Bondi walked into that courtroom thinking it was just another day. Instead, she got blindsided with a $10,000 fine. No explanation, no due process, just raw, unchecked power. But the system underestimated her. She tore apart their arguments, exposed the corruption, and backed a judge into a corner so tight, he had no choice but to fold. The fine? Overturned. The courtroom? Shaken. The system? Exposed. But make no mistake, this wasn't a win. This was a warning. Because when Pam walked out of that courthouse, she knew one thing for sure, they weren't done with her. And she sure as hell wasn't done with them. If you want more stories where the system gets pushed to its breaking point, hit that subscribe button, smash that like, and turn on notifications, because trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next.